And we're just going to move on to some of the other technologies that are around at the moment. So let's take a look at podcasting, and I think one of the great things about podcasting, of course, is portability. So you can put that little MP3 file into your MP3 player and wander around jogging, perhaps listening to selections from the course book or an audio book. And certainly it gives students control. You can control, for instance, the speed of input simply by just pausing every now and again, just to assimilate the information. Or you can listen to your podcast as many times as you want, which I think is very important. Masses of authentic materials out there now, and teachers even can create their own podcasts as well, so that's quite interesting. Next slide. Okay, the downside maybe of podcasting. We once had in the UK an announcement that there was the wrong kind of snow, and I think there are lots of different kinds of podcasts, and it's quite possible to actually find yourself with the wrong kind of podcast. One example is I listened to one podcast and it was a lady, lovely lady, reading a grammar book. The comparative of big is bigger. The superlative of big is the biggest. And I was thinking, well, what's the point of that? Well, I wouldn't want to use that in my classroom. But then you could think of listening to a podcast running through your car radio or stereo, and you think, okay, maybe that would be quite useful. So lots of different kinds. And of course, even though you can create your own podcast and perhaps edit it using a piece of software like Audacity, authoring really is not for every teacher. Next slide. Okay, let's move on to wikis, and I think Wikipedia is probably the most famous wiki in the world, and certainly wikis are affecting the way that people are approaching writing. So very, very good for collaborative writing. You have a group of students, give them a task such as write an essay, student A, student B, go and do that away from the classroom. And so student A does a draft, student B corrects the draft, and then they're working on their text, away from the classroom, as I said. And very, very good for what's called process writing. So the students come back with their text, but you can actually use the history button on the wiki to go back and see all the changes that they made. If they changed much for many, and if they changed that back again, for example. So very, very useful. However, next slide. Not all students want to learn in that kind of way. They're not always ready for from peers, for example. There is perhaps a downside. You do need a little bit of time just to get to know your wiki. It's not always necessarily intuitive. Okay, let's move on now. We've looked at IWBs, podcast wikis. We're going to have a look at interactive practice materials now. So these are the kind of exercises that you get on a CD-ROM, for example. So lots and lots of benefits. Certainly analytical learners are really enjoying the chance to practice at any time, get instant feedback from the computer. Ding! Yes, that's correct. No, sorry, that's wrong. So very, very good for those crisp areas of language where there's a very clear black and white distinction between a yes answer and a no answer. And very sophisticated tracking tools. So somebody could say, for example, you've been online using your materials for 3 hours and 25 seconds this afternoon. Okay, next slide, please. Perhaps the downside of interactive practice materials is, of course, if you write this stuff for a publisher, for example, for a CD-ROM, you really are encouraged to write questions where there is a yes and no answer. So in other words, you're tempted to actually skew a language or change it in some way to fit the exercise. The other thing, of course, is that these types of exercises really overemphasize grammar, if you like. And some teachers would even argue that they're based on a very outmoded behaviourist stimulus response methodology. And of course, just because you've been online for 3 hours and 40 minutes, I mean, what are you actually doing? Is it actually quality learning time? So there's that distinction to be made too. Next slide, please. Okay, finally, in this look at different kinds of technologies that are around, we're going to focus on electronic translators. I work at a UK university, as I mentioned, doing EAP, English for Academic Purposes. What do my students do? They bring out their translators. They're everywhere. Very, very helpful for learners, I must say. And it's nice to see them in a lecture where the lecturer is talking about fairly complex stuff and the students are just accessing the meaning from their translator. One very, very useful thing is, of course, you can check instantly from the bilingual translator and see what the English version says. So that's quite useful. And by reviewing vocabulary, for instance, I don't know, playing language games on your translator, obviously that's helping you. However, next slide, there is a downside. If you just have your translator open all the time that you're ploughing through a text, eventually you're just going to go do and check every word. You just can't, if you like, start to develop those skills such as guessing meaning from context. And also they can be very restrictive of fluency. Take the example of students doing a role play. They stand up, they come out to the front and they say, "I'd like to buy a..." And before they even say anything, the translator's in their hand, they're pressing the button, and of course lose eye contact, and that's pretty fatal. And I think any lecturer or teacher that takes in compositions, sometimes where every third word is completely bizarre, can get that feeling of, yes, well, they're being misused here for productive activities such as writing. So definitely there is a downside. Okay, so what I've done in the first part of this webinar is basically take you through 5 different kinds of technologies. There are so many more, so if you're using interesting things out there and you want to talk about them, then that's great. Please just fire in a question. What we're going to do now is move on to the second part. So we're going to basically look at what are the kinds of pedagogies that are developing nowadays. What's new, what's different. So if I use then for, I don't know, nearly 30 years ago when I started teaching out in Spain, I remember that chalkboard with the chalk and the things that I used to do, and what we're doing nowadays in terms of technology. In terms of teaching, how are these technologies changing what we actually do? So let's take a look, next slide, at a number of areas in the second part. I'll start with grammar, move on to vocabulary, and then we'll look at the 4 language skills, starting with the receptive skills and moving on to the productive skills. And then very briefly I'll finish off just with a quick mention of phonology and then some of the things that we're doing in learner training. Next slide. So let's start with the area of the area of grammar. And earlier I did mention interactive practice materials. So here we've got an example of a screen. This happens to be from the Macmillan English campus, showing the kinds of grammar materials that are out there. And what's interesting is, as a student types in an answer, the computer will give yes or no as to whether it's correct or not. So I mentioned IWBs earlier, so imagine that you're doing this kind of activity on an interactive whiteboard. So one of the nice things that you can have is not automatically have the computer generate the correct answer, but just leave it open. So you're there with your pen, and you could say to your students, "What do you think the answer is?" Come out to the front, drag over an answer to the left or the right. Do you agree? Oh, okay, you've got a different answer. Come out to the front. Where do you think this should go? So when the teacher's there in the equation, so it's the teacher, the learners and the IWB, perhaps there's a little bit more flexibility now in terms of what you can actually do with grammar activities. Next slide.